Welcome everyone to Epoch Philosophy, just in podcast form. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, podcast, everything at large at Epoch Philosophy as a whole. Consider pledging a couple dollars a month to help keep this entire project alive and get access to some really cool perks like early access to videos, voting on future videos, Discord access, editing tutorials, and the like. Without further ado, let's get into it. All right, man. So we are here with Matt McManus, are you a professor at university, where at?
University of Calgary.
Calgary, that's right. Okay, you've moved a couple places, haven't you?
Too many to count. So back in 2020, I was at Tec de Monterrey in Mexico. And then I was at, I think, Whitman College the last time we talked. And now I'm working here.
Okay. Yeah, you were at Whitman last time. We got together and talked, but so I guess we didn't have enough. We didn't have a lot of time. I suppose you probably don't really need much of an introduction, at least with my audience and stuff. They all know who you are.
That's nice.
Yeah. So I suppose we didn't get much time to talk before. It's been a while since we talked. How's everything going? How's life for you, man?
It's been hectic, man. I mean, like for a lot of people, I got a new job and I had the new book come out, and there's been all kinds of family stuff that's been going on. My brother got married, my cousin got married. I've been organizing things like that, but in some ways I like being busy rather than kind of what we had with COVID, where I just didn't know how to fill my days. So no complaints.
Right. Well, in the words of Victor, I remember he told me, I think this is probably a year ago at this point, he said you were the most productive person he's ever met. So
wow, I appreciate that. I mean, Victor's too kind, but really the secret to being productive is just two things: having a lot of people who support you and do a lot of stuff behind the scenes, and an immeasurable amount of coffee.
All right, that works.
Get those two things, and you can do anything. Believe me.
Cool. So yeah. So you are the author as well of postmodern conservatism, right? That's the other text that we talked about. At one point.
Yeah. So there are two books. What is Postmodern Conservatism, which is mostly by me, but includes a few other essays by people you know, like Plastic Pills and Eric and Borna Radnick and Dave Conrad. The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism is just by me, although it has an introduction by Pills. So.
Oh, all right. Perfect, man. Okay, cool. So I think quite a few know about that. So you have another work, like a collection of essays, right, around liberal socialism. Yeah?
Yeah, so that just came out in September. It's Liberalism and Socialism, Mortal Enemies or Embittered Kin. It's for Palgrave Macmillan. So it's an academic book, which means it's super duper expensive, which means if your listeners want to get a copy, I'd recommend they request that their library pick one up, or just find a way get a joint copy maybe to share with your friends. But it's a collection of essays, one of which is written by me along with the introduction. And then we have other people like Victor, Ben Burgess, who I'm sure a lot of your listeners know about, Jason Brennan, the libertarian thinker, who Ben has some words with, as you know, and a few other people. But our kind of aim in that book was to interrogate what the differences and associations are between liberalism and socialism and how they should both be understood in the 21st century at the end of the Cold War.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, yeah, I think there's a lot there that, in our 21st century day and age of social media, politics, and the world of sort of, I want to say like almost political entertainment. That might be the best way to put it. There's not.
No, I mean, you get the sharpest, most nuanced takes in Twitter. We all know that.
Oh, yeah, of course. Twitter, Facebook's probably a whole other level of bad just to do with a specific generation at this point taking over Facebook. And that's not millennials or Gen Zers. That's boomers and Gen Xers. So that might be a little worse. But yeah, so.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, every day on Facebook, I get the weirdest fucking messages from people. And I'm not sure what to make of them because some of them are just bots and I'm like, whatever, delete. But I'll get messages from people being like, I saw an article you wrote. Would you mind listening to my music? I wrote these 3 albums. Listen to them all and get back to me. And I'm like, how much fucking time do you think I have? Like,
Dude.
maybe one song if I'm feeling in a good mood, that's something. But just to fucking bombard somebody with like, oh, here's a book I wrote, read it and get back to me.
Yeah, man.
Like,
I mean, you probably deal with that more, right? You're an author. You have all kinds of articles everywhere. You probably deal with the whole messaging thing. I suppose. I mean, I deal with the same thing sometimes. Granted, it's this is probably a on all things considered, it's a good problem to have, I suppose. But yeah, sometimes you'll get people who are like, "Hey, man, I wrote this paper. Could you like proofread this for me?" I'm like, "Oh my god, dude!" Like, I'm like, "Holy shit!" I'm sitting here working like 10 hours a day and doing stuff, and it's like, dude, I can't. But yeah, so
100%, yeah. And I'm also like, I have my own students, right? All fucking 114 of them, and I'm like, yeah, sorry, I don't quite have the time to be taking on more editorial duties. It's just not in the cards, bud.
For sure. So I think rightfully so, like liberal socialism is a really interesting topic, and it's a topic that gets brushed over. And it kind of always has confused me a little bit. I'm sure as of you as well, as people who I suppose like take the sort of political theory canon seriously, or we've like actually delved into it. Of course, like when you deal with social media and the way people communicate now, there's only so much nuance, like you said, that could go into it. So we kind of gloss over early liberal thinkers and we go straight for, especially if you're a disgruntled leftist who's upset about a lot of status quo politics, rightfully so. You brush over and go straight to Marx or go straight to, I mean, even further like Lenin and stuff like that. So, but there's a whole host of like, again, philosophy and political theory that like, obviously has informed Marx, people like Lenin, and that seems to get kind of glossed over. So I suppose, like, as far as liberal socialism goes, who might be some of the people that you are thinking of as liberal socialist, or what sort of period in time or events might be sort of interesting if you're going to give an introduction to people like that?
Absolutely. I should say personally, I get all my ideas from Dave Rubin, the big idea guy on the internet, right? So anything that I say or do is really plagiarized from him. My dirty little secret, just for all your listeners. But anyway, no, I kid. Liberal socialism actually has a very long history. And it begins, if you want, at the end of the 18th century in the work of people like, for instance, William Godwin, the great anarchist thinker. And these kinds of authors and the need to have fundamentally recalibrate how it is that we understand power and its association with the state, but also economic power, right? Mm-hmm. And this wasn't something that a lot of the early liberals paid a great deal of attention to. Many of them did. So, for instance, if you read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, despite his kind of status as a kind of or capitalist Bible, there's actually a lot of stuff written by Smith about the way that corporate interests, when they bind together, almost always conspire against the public good, why it is that you need the state to kind of check monopolization, and why it also needs to provide certain basic goods to citizens to offset the consequences of unbridled markets, which you foresaw coming in the future, right? But generally speaking, most liberals don't talk too much about it. Godwin was amongst the first to do so. And then you see a host of other liberal thinkers come to the fore, who are, including the young Marx, I should say, who are deeply concerned with these kinds of problems. And my writing draws a lot of inspiration from authors like this. The young humanistic Marx, for example, John Stuart Mill, who identified as a socialist near the end of his life. Mary Wollstonecraft, not a socialist, but deeply concerned about things like economic equality. She actually wrote a scathing denunciation of Edmund Burke for not taking that seriously. And then later on in the 20th century, you start to see the tradition evolve and become a lot more strident in its objectives of reconciling liberalism and socialism in the work of people like, for instance, John Rawls, who's probably the biggest influence on me. So that's where I'm coming from.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I think, and again, we have at least in the PillPod community and then I suppose the Epoch philosophy community, which are very deeply intertwined. I think we have a lot of people who probably wouldn't associate with the title of liberal or liberalism. So I guess
don't need to tell me.
Sure, yeah, I'm sure you know very, very well. And there's some I don't know. Sometimes the whole like I'm a we're all fans of continental philosophy here, but sometimes some people in the continental fields get a little ridiculous with stuff like that. Ironically, so I suppose there's a descriptive element here, right? To say that liberalism isn't necessarily like by definition antithetical to things like socialism, and socialism isn't a sort of thing or system that is directly tied to things like Marxism. I think most people who are listening or watching from our perspective, they probably know this, but I suppose for other people who don't. I guess that's the descriptive element, right? That's the thing. Is there like a prescriptive tonality, like a reason why because you consider yourself a liberal socialist, right? Is that correct? So is
liberal democratic socialist, right? So
right.
The democracy bit is really important.
For sure. Okay, perfect. So with liberal socialism, say in the 21st century, what is the appeal to you that say other forms of like say Marxism or other, I don't know, ideologies as well. So what's appealing to you in a prescriptive sense about liberal socialism?
Well, I should say I find Marxism very appealing, right? Sure. I keep on joking with other people that one day my opus is going to be a great big book. It'll be 5,000 pages. No one will read it. I'll die at the end of it, and it'll be an attempt to reconcile Marx and Rawls, right? Which is kind of my big ambition, right? But all joking aside about that, look, I think that what inspired me to take this seriously, and I'll just speak a little bit personally here, was when I came up in grad school, imbibed a lot of the kind of continental philosophy traditions that you're talking about, right? Almost all of whom are scathingly critical of liberalism, and we should be critical of liberalism, very critical, I should say. But one of the things that always bothered me about it is I would think to myself, well, a lot of the things that liberals are committed to, freedom of religion, multicultural toleration, freedom of expression, fair trials, right? Not being subject to cruel and unusual punishment are things that any leftist should be committed to. Right? If anything, we should be saying that we want more of that, please, more than the liberal state actually guarantees. So when I started thinking about that, it occurred to me that what we really wanted wasn't necessarily to throw away everything that liberalism had accomplished, which, by the way, I don't think Marx wanted either, as a good dialectical theorist. And we can get into that if you want. What we want to do is preserve these really powerful and interesting elements of liberalism and then carry them forward to a more just economic form of democracy, right? Mm-hmm. And I should say, just to kind of add on to that I think liberals are sensitive to some forms of power and domination that socialists sometimes marginalize or don't pay as much attention to as they should, or at least classical socialists, right? Mm-hmm. So, for instance, one of the things that Bukharin criticized Marx for is precisely that he was a little bit too confident that the state could kind of enact the broad sweeping changes that he wanted without descending into tyranny. Now, I think that Bukharin's criticism of vulgar Marxism is accurate. I think Marx's own view is a little bit more nuanced. But many vulgar Marxists didn't take this warning seriously and just put a lot of faith in the state to essentially enact socialism for the top down. And we all know what the consequences were, right? Mm-hmm. And many liberal theorists would have warned against this by saying that you cannot trust the state to enact these kind of changes without becoming tyrannical. We need to have a division of powers precisely to make sure that no one body or no one person in the state is capable of the kinds of domination that you saw in the Soviet command economies or the Maoist system. And so I also want to take those kinds of lessons on board, right? The importance of dividing powers, making sure that it's not concentrated, empowering the state to achieve something like an economic justice without risking it becoming domineering or dictatorial.
Gotcha. Okay. No, I think those are all really good answers, and I think that have made a lot of sense. And I think that's something that I've found a little bit, especially when reading, at least I saw a lot of levels of continuity, especially with thinkers like Rousseau and Marx. And Rousseau is obviously a very liberal thinker. I think to me, that's kind of like informed a lot of how like I approach a lot of early Marxism. I know that it's not the cool thing to to sort of lump early Marxism in with a lot of like late liberalism, or even not even late liberalism, just liberalism in general. But that's something I've been seeing more and more relevant as time goes on, for better or worse, right? It's not making a value judgment here. It's just like I think that's the most accurate way historically to like look at it. And so I suppose now you brought up we could go into Marx as a dialectical thinker, which is, I think, completely correct. I know there are some people, believe it or not, I don't know if you've heard this, Matt, but like there's a whole community of like not a whole community, a couple big Marxists who have talked about doing away with like the actual dialectical method, as it's like. It's hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, you want to have fucking Marx without dialectics? You might as well say we want fucking coffee without coffee beans.
Yeah, it's. I think.
All right. Well, I'm not even sure what that would be, but
right. This guy, I actually, oddly enough, dude, I saw it. Someone sent it to me. It was like this guy wrote like 900 pages explaining why dialectics should be. No, it's ridiculous. I sifted through like 5 pages, but essentially went through is like why dialectics is harmful to Marxism, why. Oh God, I think that's pretty much it. Why it's harmful, why we don't need it, and why it will curtail socialism in the future. I think it was probably the best way to sum it up is that it was a very probably vulgar Leninist approach to like,
I see.
Maybe even like the best way I could probably describe it was probably Stalinist. That there's a failure to understanding power relations within the dialectical method and stuff like that. Nonetheless, Marx, especially early humanist Marx, like you said. I think it's very fair to say Marx was more in line with like liberalism in that, especially in that sphere, than he was with like the sort of Leninist tradition, which is not something people want to admit. Again, for better or worse. So I guess we can talk about that a little bit. The early continuity with liberalism, and say Marxism or Marx himself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is an extremely important topic, both theoretically and politically. Right. Mm-hmm. But it's worth noting that I think that even the older Marx was cognizant of these issues. Right. Mm-hmm. Maybe even more cognizant than the younger Marx. And a number of really great Marxist theorists like Igor Shukabroad, who I've talked about quite a bit, or Terry Eagleton have pointed this out. Right. That the young Marx was deeply committed to a kind of radical, highly democratic liberalism, as you would have to be, as a newspaper guy writing in autocratic Prussia, where he was being censored left, right, and center. Obviously, he was somebody who was going to be very committed to things like freedom of expression, freedom of association, rights to political agitation. And he supported a huge number of liberal causes over the course of his lifetime, most notably universal suffrage, universal male suffrage. You can criticize him from a feminist standpoint for that, for the working classes, mm-hmm. right? But beyond these kinds of incidental political commitments, one of the things that's noteworthy about Marx is, again, this dialectical historical method, where he insists that, look, every society needs to pass through a kind of bourgeois epoch in order to reach the socialist kind of utopia in the future. And you can criticize the teleological kind of connotations there, but this is the kind of argument, right? And he says, look, once you appreciate that, you realize that there's no radical breaks in history of the sort, for instance, fetishized by many Leninists, right? Mm-hmm. For whom revolution is the point because it's exciting and millenarian and all that stuff. A lot more like George Sorel, I should say, than somebody like Karl Marx, right? Mm-hmm. And he says, look, even after the revolution, there's going to be a very long transitory period where any kind of new socialist society that emerges will be, as you put it, stamped by many features of the old bourgeois order, as it must be, right? Mm-hmm. And he doesn't give any timelines or a lot of specifics about this because, as you know, he's much more focused on criticizing capital. But I think this is the properly dialectical approach to take, that you're not going to see any gigantic breaks like year one kind of epoch-minded thinking from a genuine Marxism. You're going to see gradual transitions with revolutionary passages to a new form of society. But that new form of society itself is going to have a lot of features of the old one as you gradually move towards ever greater egalitarianism.
Right. I think that's I think it's really interesting too. Something I don't know if you have heard this as well. Something I recently read was talking about some speeches Lenin gave actually, and this was right after the Russian Revolution. He gave a speech and talked about I think almost verbatim explicitly said that, like, don't be confused. The new system that we have right now, the Soviet Union that just emerged, he said it isn't a socialist system. He said he proposed that, like, look, I think our theoretical, like, sort of grounding has been disrupted by this event, and that, like, socialism being the sort of catalyst that will move us towards communism, he said, I don't think it's that simple. He said, if we're going to dismantle, say, a feudal or capitalist system, there almost, in a way, has to be a transition into socialism. And he said that's the transition that they were in right now, which is very different. Like, especially when you hear a lot of the debate between real existing socialist states and non-existing socialist states. It's ironic and hilarious that a lot of the defense that a lot of people will say that, like, look, the USSR was an existing socialist state, we should recognize them as such. It's really interesting, and I did not know this, that Lenin himself explicitly said, like, no, like, this is not a socialist state, and he made a couple arguments around, like, internationalism within his speech and stuff like that, and how the development is just so raw, he can't quite say that this is the socialist state that he envisioned, rather that there's a process going towards it. So I just found that really interesting. I had no idea about that speech. It was I don't know where or when, but really, really interesting stuff. So
absolutely. And I want to say, I think that's in part because Lenin was a genuine dialectical theorist. He used to say that, if you really wanted to understand Marx's method, the Rosetta Stone, that's not exactly the term he used, is Hegel's Science of Logic, right? Which, if you ever go through it, is not exactly a Rosetta Stone in the sense that it allows you to more easily translate things, but it is a very rich text, right? So, he was cognizant of these kind of dialectical qualities. But I should say that one of the problems I find with a lot of vulgar Marxism is, again, this fetishism of millenarian thinking, this idea that revolution for its own sake is good because it has a kind of purifying quality to it.
Right.
And it allows us to have a new crop by burning down the old one. Right.
Right.
Now, whatever else you want to say about that, that is not Marxist. Right. In the sense of recognizing the dialectical continuity and necessity, for that matter, of what came before to what's going to come forthwith.
Right. And I was going to add,
we can miss a lot of that, but I think that's very important to note.
Right. No, 150%. I was actually going to kind of go in. I think that's a lot of people's view of, like, dialectics. That's really incorrect. It's like, it's almost I don't know, it's the, maybe not the, I don't know, not the antithesis, thesis, and synthesis sort of thing. But at the same time, there's, like, this, they think that, like, again, the rupture aspect of dialectics, or the sort of revolution, is, like, the whole core of dialectics as a whole. And I think it's a kind of a weird thing that's emerged. But again, I think it's like, if we can, at least try to think, there's probably, like, a very big libidinal aspect to that, right? Like, people are quite,
absolutely,
yeah. People are quite unhappy, miserable. They're pent up, and, like, again, capitalism has definitely showed itself to be one of the more alienating systems, and that like, sort of, in many ways, disrupts a lot of how we think about just basic, very well established, like, philosophy, right, and dialectics. But that's something that I see all the time. It's like, no, like, I'm a dialectician. That means we need to, like, revolution, and I'm like, that's not dialectics, man. Like, it's not like, but I don't know. Interesting. That's something I see quite, like, all the time.
Yeah, me too. And I should say that, I do think that one of the things that dialectics inclines us to is a unity of theory and praxis, right? So one of the nice things about the method is precisely that if you are kind of a historical materialist, you can't just be an armchair intellectual, right? You need to engage in the world because, of course, the point is to change it, right?
Right.
But, of course, one of the things that Marx continuously insisted upon is that in order to change the world effectively, you need to understand it, right? And so at points, this kind of millenarian revolutionary fetishism that we see really emphasizes the praxis dimension of Marxism at the expense of the theory dimension to it. And I think this is a big mistake precisely because it puts so much weight on doing something, anything, as long as it's big and dramatic, that there are very few questions asked about whether or not this is actually going to be effective and bring about the kind of society that we want. Right?
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that whatever else you want to say about Lenin, this is one of the great errors that you see when people fantasize about the qualities associated with the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution, right? Were the systems that they overcame terrible and in need of radical transformation? Absolutely. Were they replaced by anything that we want to try to emulate? Not at all, right? And so the theory dimension of Marxism, where we actually ask ourselves these kinds of questions, like what do you want, as Zizek would put it, is exceptionally important. And I think it's what we need a lot more of today. And it's where I'm kind of coming from as a liberal socialist, where I say, look, there's a lot of things in liberalism that we want to preserve. And not only do we want to preserve them, we should be insisting to liberals that they're centrist liberals, that these kinds of virtues of liberalism are safer in our hands than they are certainly in the hands of postmodern conservatives, nationalist conservatives, or even the goddamn classical liberal types like Dave Rubin, right?
100%. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess there's a lot there. I think whenever we think about like, it always comes to mind how I want to say like waves of populism, right? I think like what you're talking about, the lack of theory. I've always found that at least like how we qualify or what we would describe as like populism, I think there seems to be a continual, consistent lack of like intellectual engagement in that regard. I think you've had a kind of a critique of, I don't know exactly what your critique of populism is, but I imagine it might be something similar, where I noticed that like, at least if my understanding of populism, people's definitions of populism vary quite widely, but populism and waves of populism, one of the bad things that happens is, again, it's like almost praxis for the sake of just praxis or action without any real core focus essentially on what's going on. And I find that like today, I can't see like a larger marking than that with like what's going on in almost every sphere of politics. It's not, I almost think that in some ways like populism is a wave that affects everything. It's not like, the populist wave or whatever. It's not like, oh, the, Republican Tea Party. No. Like it's something that I think encompasses entire political systems or groups of people. And I think like all around, whether that be left wingers, whether that be right wingers, I think a sort of political wave that we are experiencing today is the absolute abandonment of a lot of intellectual sort of, I want to say, focus, I suppose. So I'm curious what you think about that, and I don't know if that ties in. I recently did you write an article about populism and a critique of populism? I think you may have wrote something like that. I remember.
I didn't write specifically on that. I have written about populism before.
Gotcha. Is that something similar, or is there a different critique within that, or?
Oh, absolutely, right. So here, I think actually Wendy Brown is our most useful guide. I also think that she's the most brilliant critical theorist working right now, but that's another question.
Sure.
Long story short, one of the things that she points out is when we're trying to be good Marxists, we also need to be good Nietzscheans by asking ourselves, what are the psychological motivations behind the kinds of politics people are agitating for, because that can tell you a lot about what it is that they're actually trying to accomplish, right? And one of the things that she points out is the conservatives always like to claim that the left is motivated by ressentiment or resentment, right? We just want to tear the successful people down to allow the mediocre to rise to the top. And Brown points out that that's actually not true. If you think about the most resentment-driven form of politics that we see in the world right now, almost all of it is coming from the political right. There's this notion that we have privileges, you cannot take those away because they belong to us. And if you do, then that's not fair. And if you really interrogate what kind of policies are being proposed to agitate against conservative positions, people don't even want to take away their privileges. Usually, they just want to universalize them to grant them to everyone, right? So the resentment is even more noxious in the sense that what it's really motivated by is this belief that I have something that no one else has, and I get joy or pleasure from the fact that no one else is able to have this. and I don't want it to be shared in that kind of way, right? Think about things like tuition, right? And Brown points out that if we're going to have an effective left in the 21st century, it cannot be one that's motivated by ressentiment, because then that makes us better, sure, in some senses than conservative-driven resentment politics, but also ineffective, because what we really want is to be talking not about who screwed us over and how it is that their day is going to come, which is often what I find in a lot of the kind of revolutionary fetishism that we see. Again, there's this idea of the purifying function that violence is going to serve. Right? We don't want any of that. What we really want to do is put forward a positive, hopeful agenda for how whatever it is that we put forward, and it's going to look different in different contexts, is going to transform the vast majority of people's lives for the better, including many of the conservatives who are now opposed to us. Right. Be the bigger men, if you want to put it that way. And I think the most successful left movements of the 21st century so far have focused precisely on that. Think about something like Black Lives Matter in 2016, when they put forward a remarkable platform for economic justice, very much modeled on the Nordic countries, right? That was something that was extremely powerful and tied to this idea that we need to achieve racial justice through economic justice, and part and parcel of our economic justice. Right. Or you could think about the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2020. We were all very disappointed that, of course, he's not President Sanders at this point, but he did something remarkable in putting things like an agenda for universal healthcare in the United States firmly into the political mindset where it hasn't gone away. Is there a lot more to be done? Absolutely. But it's a big first step to get that door open. Right. So these kinds of non-resentment, constructive, hopeful politics are the kinds of things that I want to see leftists put forward. And the association of that with something like liberal socialism is, I think that liberal socialism is a very good kind of political system. And it's something that many people could endorse from a variety of different perspectives. And it's what I'd want to see us put forward on the agenda.
Right. I guess from here, no. I think those are all really good things. I guess where my mind has been sifting through this sort of the question around liberalism and the sort of dynamics in, I suppose, left politics. I think like there's something maybe you can help me sift through this, but and I kind of wanted to ask you or propose this to you or whatever. It's probably a very amateur approach that you've already thought about. So I'm curious about your answer. I always thought about that, like liberalism, at least the sort of, I would say kind of the core true liberalism, is something similar to like what you propose. It's like around, I would say, in many ways, economic justice, a sort of a general guideline of equality for most people in the most abstract sense, and stuff like that. And I think these things are all really good, like suffrage, voting rights, the establishment of courts and a judicial system that is fair to people despite, class and gender, race, what be it. I think these are all incredibly great prescriptive things that not only would like impact society positively, but like I think a lot of people can relate to, because we do sort of live on an ideological foundation of liberalism. I think where I'm like, okay, what do we do about this? Where I'm like, okay, here's a problem we have now, is it's that I almost think that there is this foundation, like a foundation that we do lay on sociologically that is like from liberal principles, but the way people act, like the way people sort of, maybe this is a Zizekian point, the way people go about things seems to supersede that completely. And it seems like in some ways, like the way we act is very, and we live day to day, is a very almost like postmodern hedonism, where we can describe the descriptive element of human behavior is so far away from liberalism that even when we prescribe these things like voting rights and all these things, there is such a heavy cynicism, like you talked about, resentment, and right-wingers being resentful. Like, for example, man, we have in Kansas City, we're one of the only cities in the United States that has completely free public transportation, no matter how small that transportation system is. And it's wonderful.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it is awesome. And we have a rail car system throughout the city, like that goes straight up and down. And there's continual expansions, but on Facebook, I'll see the occasional local article talking about, oh, the expansion plan, this and this and that. And the entire comment section is like literally boomers like, who's going to fucking pay for it? Or I'm not paying for that. They don't even live in Kansas City. They live in like the outside suburbs and they're talking about being taxed about something they'll never be taxed for. But that is such like, I think that's such common, like cynical behavior that just, it almost like supersedes any real rationalism or any like fucking core logic that I think you might find in a descriptor of like the liberal ideal of individuality. And I just think that like in some ways descriptively, we are so far beyond that. So maybe if you're understanding my whole point, like these are great prescriptive things, but descriptively we are so far away from that. What would you propose? What is something that maybe we can alleviate that huge divide with what is and what should be?
Sure. I think that's a fantastic question, man. And we could be here for hours discussing it. Right?
Sure.
So I'll give the Coles notes and I'll divide it into a theory and a practice kind of section. Okay. Theoretically, I think there are a lot of good things to liberalism. There's also a lot of crap to liberalism. Right. And here I'll make a kind of analytical distinction between the kind of possessive individualist liberalism that we need to be sharply critical of, that conceives of freedom as being exclusively consumer freedom through the market. Not freedom to choose the kind of society you live in, not substantive freedom, like the freedom to live a kind of flourishing life. Because if the market doesn't intend for you to lead a flourishing life, then that's not in the cards for you, right? And we need to distinguish between that and a more robust, expressive kind of individualism that you see associated with liberal egalitarianism. So possessive individualist liberalism was always tentatively committed to real equality. Because we see possessive individualists from people like Locke through Hayek and Milton Friedman argue is that while people might start out equal, they become unequal over time through activity in the market, right? And these inequalities are entirely justifiable because they're predicated on how hard someone works or their contribution to the economy. And so the state or civil society should in no way try to interfere with them. And if that leads to inequities of power forming, then those are also justifiable, right? And a lot of this is the theoretical bedrock for the neoliberal order that you rightly described as extremely alienating. And we need to condemn it in the strongest possible terms. But liberal egalitarianism had a very kind of different outlook. Liberal egalitarianism held that people are all fundamentally moral equals. And because they are moral equals, they are entitled to a high degree of freedom because there's something deeply wrong about having a vision of the good life or expectations about your life imposed upon you by power if you're the equal of everyone else. It's up to you to sort out what kind of things you want to commit your life to. Now, that doesn't mean that any life is just as good as any others, because some people might make wiser choices, but you should be left free to do so. Right. And the liberal egalitarian tradition always was much more sensitive to the needs for a certain level of economic flourishing for all in order to achieve this kinds of mission. Again, all the figures that I talked about, people like John Stuart Mills, who declared himself a socialist at the end of his life, or John Rawls, who endorsed property-oriented democracy or liberal socialism as the only kind of society that could meet real liberal principles of justice. Their outlook was very different than that of the possessive individualists in this respect, right? So what we need in certain respects to do is to perform an operation where we chop off all the bad possessive individualist dimensions of liberalism and reestablish its radical egalitarian core as being at the forefront of a new united socialism and liberalism, right?
Yeah.
Now, practically, what I think that this is going to mean is that we're going to need to change people's hearts and minds about what kind of social policies are actually to their benefit and to the benefit of the community as a whole. And I don't think that there's any easy solution to that. And it's going to look very different depending on where you are. And I think one of the problems that a lot of leftists have is they have difficulty shifting gears when it comes to making the pitch for a more egalitarian style of politics to people who don't immediately operate in their bubble, right? I mean, I've seen leftist theorists who'll go talk to solid blue-collar guys who work in a union who would 100% be inclined to support at least some egalitarian policies. And they'll go talk to them about Marx and dialectics and all that stuff. Nobody wants to hear that. You know what I mean? for a lot of people, what you're going to need to do is say, look, the primary people who should be paying for a lot of the reforms that we want to see done, including the radical reforms, are the rich, right? The 1% who have gotten away with murder over the last 40 years, who are not contributing their fair share to society, and who are spending their fucking money building rocket ships to go to space while the rest of us are sitting here and can't even get $900 a month during the middle of a pandemic to support our families. That's really wrong, right?
Right.
But, beyond that, I think we can say that, look, in the event that some people have to pay more taxes, or even you in the middle classes need to pay more taxes, you get an awful lot from that. So think about the United States, right? The United States spends some years twice as much on healthcare as a European social democracy. And what do you get for that?
Right.
For the vast majority of people, it is inferior, far more bureaucratically oriented healthcare than the universal systems that you find in the social democracies. Think about things like tuition, post-secondary education, right? The United States has the highest cost for post-secondary education in the goddamn world, right? You're talking tens of thousands of dollars in debt for many students. All of that could be taken care of if we were to create a public post-secondary system through taxation that provided service at or very near cost, which is, again, what Bernie Sanders was close to proposing, right? And there are countries that have done that. For instance, Finland, Sweden, and not so incidentally, the quality of education is extremely high. Costs are much lower. So you get what you pay for with taxes. And in fact, you might get an awful lot more if you're willing to commit to those kind of things than if you allow them to be more, organized by a for-profit market.
Right.
I think making the case for these kinds of things to people and saying you get more bang for your buck, if you want to put it that way, through these kinds of mechanisms is a good way to start broaching the subject of radical reform.
Sure. Yeah. I think those are, again, like all extremely, extremely well put, very good immediate arguments. I think something, though, maybe I can pick at that a little bit, that sort of, I think all of this might, and I'm curious what you'd think, it kind of like almost still presupposes a level of the rational individual that is able to like sort of hear these things and say, in a perfect world, you can present these things in such a way that aren't totalizing or that don't adhere to a sort of aesthetic, say like Marxism or what they might think is Marxism, and it totally like shuts them off. How do we even like approach the level of, because this relies on discourse, how do we approach the level of discourse here where we can actually break through and do that? I know you touched on that a little bit when you said that, like, they don't want to hear about Marx and dialectics, because they sure as fuck don't. I grew up in a very blue collar family and a very blue collar community. They sure as fuck don't want to do that. A lot of union members don't even half the time even like, they don't even think about that they're in a union. Like, it's really bizarre. There's like, it's insane. So how do we move past that? Because I think almost in some ways, right, you are a liberal, but like, do you recognize that the sort of problem that might come from the idea within liberalism that all of this is sort of on a foundation that there's some level of like rationale for the subject, right, the person who lives in the society? How do you kind of reconcile that? Do you completely disagree, or do you what are your thoughts on that?
No, I completely agree. I mean, my book on postmodernity, including the new one that I have coming out in a couple of months, to be determined the exact release date, but soon, are exactly on this topic. Because when I put on my advocacy hat, I try to show optimism of the will. But certainly when I put on my critical theory hat and I analyze all the different dynamics that limit the way that we can conceive of a new society, all the different ways that people are alienated, and how that alienation channels itself into all kinds of reactionary rather than the progressive politics, I suddenly put on my cynicism or pessimism of the intellect hat, right? And I'm not sure necessarily how we go about resolving this tension, because there are tremendous forces that are set against us. And not just the kind of highly theorized sources that somebody like you and I might talk about, right? The forms of alienation that emerge in late capitalism, the various forms of subjective interpolation that are determined by power, including disciplinary forms of power, the different ways that neoliberalization alienates and breaks down communities and the possibility for resistance. I'm talking about things that are a lot more practical, a lot more tangible, like the fact that, especially in the United States right now, the rich just have massively more resources to advance revanchist policies and to convince people to accept revanchist policies than the left does. You look at somebody like Bernie Sanders, almost no major newspaper endorsed his candidacy for president, even though he was the front runner of the Democratic Party for a little while, right? I think the biggest newspaper that endorsed him was a little paper in Detroit. It was their subscription base was like 100,000 people. It's nothing, Of course, it didn't keep Dave Rubin and all the others from being like, the mainstream media is all siding up with socialism, blah, blah, but whatever. And you kind of sit there and you confront all that. And you're like, well, where the fuck do we even begin? Now, how do we begin to confront all that? Right. And I think my response to that is that we need to start the way that we always have on the left, which is small, incremental, slow, and build from there. And we do need to recognize that there have been victories in the past, even in the face of tremendous odds. Again, you think about revolutionary transformation in the United States or America as paradigm cases, right? But you can also think about all the efforts it took over an entire century to even get something like the labor movement built. But eventually it was built. It's been rolled back tremendously since the 1980s, but what once was can be built again. Right. Or you think again about the Nordic democracies that I usually point to as the paradigm case for the best possible country in the world right now. Right. There are imperfections, but I think that's what the closest thing to the model we should be aiming for is, a lot of people point to the Nordic democracies and say, well, they've always been kind of egalitarianism. Not at all. Right. Sweden and Norway and Denmark were highly autocratic societies dominated by big business at the beginning of the 20th century. They were extremely poor, and they didn't have mass colonial empires to kind of prop them up like many of the advanced capitalist states did. But there was a real militant movement for greater equality, often spearheaded by socialist parties and general strikes by the labor movement that eventually demanded and achieved change from business and economic elites, right? And that change has proven sustainable enough that it's never actually been entirely taken away, even in the neoliberal era, precisely because it's become so popular and entrenched within the Nordic system, right? So there are victories that we can point to. And one of the kind of things that I say that should make us optimistic is because our policies are better, and I really believe that, right? If we can actually get them enacted and put them into place, they will stick because there will be such overwhelming support for them that there'll be no going back on them. And you can see examples of that as well. Think about something like universal healthcare in Canada, the United Kingdom, or pretty much in any of the European social democracies. There was stiff resistance to implementing universal health programs in all those countries, from the medical industry, from economic elites, from conservatives. But once they got through, no one has been able to challenge that. Margaret Thatcher desperately wanted to, but even her party would have none of that because they said there'd be rioting in the streets and we'd all be booted out of office. So if we get our policies out there, actually institute radical change that make people's lives better, I think that you're going to see that it sticks around.
Right. So I get there's a little bit, again, this is an antithetical, right, to like, I suppose a more sort of socialist tinge towards liberalism, but I get a stark materialism here from you that seems to be not like very common among a lot of like liberal descriptors, at least in how we get those policies enacted, right? So you made the point that like, look, like these policies are better. And well, not only do I agree with that, but I do agree that like once these policies are enacted, it does seem to be the case that like, even extremely right-wing parties tend to bend towards them, even if they still try to slowly disintegrate them, right? So, in Canada,
if you want a good example in the United States, think about Obamacare, right?
Right.
Obamacare, after it was instituted, was basically the satanic verses for the Republican Party. You know what I mean? Like they just could not fucking stand it, and everyone from Ted Cruz to Mitch McConnell stood up and said, we are going to oppose it and get rid of it the minute we can. Then you have a president who comes into office, controls both houses of Congress and the Supreme Court. And Obamacare was definitely undermined, but it's still there precisely because it's so popular and so many people depend upon it that the Republican Party realized there'd be rioting in the streets if they just got rid of it wholesale. Right. So that's a kind of change in the right direction. Not nearly enough, but a change.
Sure. Yeah. So, right. So I guess I'll kind of like, I guess I can kind of continue from there. I do agree that like that seems to absolutely be the case. Not only it doesn't even matter what I think that's statistically the case. Like you look in Canada and the UK, like there was a big shift after these universal programs were implemented, where the parties had to really shift instead of like the Republican Party is doing in the United States, where they're not shifting, they're attacking voting rights. Right? They know that their end days are coming, so I suppose their political immediate their immediate policy end days are coming, at least with what they're able to propose, and they see that, and so they're attacking voting rights. And in Europe, that wasn't really the case; they just shifted on policy. I see though. You talked about how these like general strikes, these labor movements, is that like the prescribing force? Like, is that how we get to this area within your mind? Because I see that like a lot of the times with like liberal thinkers, the one thing I can kind of pick apart a little bit is that sometimes it seems a little bit vacuous from the perspective of power relations, right? And where that may come from, and how that may interact with a given sociological order or something like that. These things may all be true, right? Like these policies work and are better, but how do we reconcile the immediate power divide? And like, I don't know, like because in my mind, this still points towards like sort of the I almost want to say the impotence of simply like, yeah, just a general, I don't know if I have the words to describe it, just a general impotence on presenting these sort of policy goals or like what's going on and the general sort of population and how that may happen. Because I'm with you with the general strikes and those in the sort of labor movements, but like, fuck, we are so far gone from that. Is there a way we build that up within your sort of model? Or, yeah, I don't know. I guess it's just a very broad question, so...
Absolutely right. And here I actually think that we need to give the devil their due and actually take a page from the book of conservatism, right? So take the conservative movement in the United States, arguably one of the most successful through the 20th century, right? In the 1950s through the 1960s, many conservatives felt that they had just completely lost the plot, that a kind of welfarist, socially minded liberalism was increasingly becoming hegemonic post the Depression. There was very little they could do to turn back the tide. And there was almost an alarmism that something like democratic socialism, or at least socially minded liberalism, was going to be instituted and become the kind of permanent political order in the United States. Flash forward to the 1980s, you have the Reagan Revolution, the Thatcher Revolution, and things completely change, where you have a very muscular, confident conservatism just wiping out a lot of the gains that the left was able to achieve over the course of the 1930s. The way they did that isn't because their policies suddenly became more popular, although that was part of it. It was by building the party infrastructure in part, but also think tanks, social networks, community groups, forming ties to different kinds of civil society organizations, especially churches, right? All these became part of a network of conservatism in the United States that was willing to back up its primary political view, called the Republican Party. And so when all these things kind of catalyzed in the 1980s, they were ready to enact not just a political revolution, but a social-cultural revolution in favor of their kind of outlook. And what we need is something analogous to that on the left. And what that means is absolutely focusing on the party level, trying to get candidates like AOC or Bernie Sanders elected, right? And get them elected to prominent offices. But we also need to build the kind of infrastructure on the ground that networks with a lot of other segments of society and creates a kind of built-in activist movement that is going to be willing to support the primary political vehicles through which we try to enact change when it comes to election time, but is also going to be extremely active, changing hearts and minds when elections aren't happening. And I think that one of the key things that key steps to this is rejuvenating the labor movement, because one of the things about unions over the course of the 1930s to the 1960s was that they provided a kind of permanent bulwark of power for the left in the United States and in many other countries. So not coincidentally, they were one of the first things that people like Reagan and Thatcher tried to smash when they got into power, right? Mm-hmm. Now, is this going to change everything if we just increase union membership to what we saw in the 1950s? No, it's not going to. If that was, the key step, then we never would have seen these kind of retreats in the 1980s. But it's absolutely a necessary step to rebuild those kinds of institutions. And beyond that, I think that what we need to see is far greater efforts to connect the political vehicles for transformation to the kind of civil society groups and activist groups that I was talking about. Because one of the reasons why you saw social liberalism fail in the mid-20th century is it was very much a top-down enterprise run by technocrats and other elites, right? And you saw that with the Labor Party and the Democratic Party in the United States. And so not coincidentally, they lost energy, lost legitimacy over time. That's not something, again, you saw in the Nordic context, where there was always this extremely tight association between radical groups in civil society and things like the Social Democratic Party in Sweden, right? Mm-hmm. And so consequently, these parties always had a lot more energy and a much firmer base to rely upon when advancing their transformative policies. So we need a far less top-down kind of orientation towards leftist transformation than what we saw in the major democracies in the mid part of the 20th century. And we need a much more kind of bottom-up kind of outlook in the 21st century.
Gotcha. Okay. So I suppose, and this again is it's so broad. So that probably does. So again, that comes from the labor movement and sort of the revitalization of labor organization and maybe even more radical political sentiments within those organizations. That seems to be such a problem, like with what I see today, living in the United States, that doesn't get talked about enough. Like, it's not only that, like, we have such low union membership, but there's another half that never gets talked about. There is no understanding where their union that they are in came from, how it came about, the sort of organizational practices of the past. And it's like really bizarre. I think, I know a lot of people that I grew up around, they're in unions. They're in unions. They do a lot of laborious work, and they're all like staunch Republicans. It's so common. It is extremely, extremely common. We had a situation in Missouri. God, I can't even remember what it was called. It was Proposition 1, essentially a bill or a law that was going to come in and make Missouri a right-to-work state, which in the United States, that essentially means like that cut down on union membership and people can opt out of union dues and stuff. It cripples unions all across the United States. And what was really bizarre is a lot of these people who are always very staunch Republicans came out against Proposition 1. And it was a Republican-led bill. So I'm with you. Labor,
absolutely, and I think that's a serious problem, right?
Right.
That's sometimes unaddressed because there is certainly a divide between what's sometimes called the culturally minded left and the kind of old labor movement. The culturally minded left typically agitates for things like higher levels of social inclusion by historically marginalized groups, usually identified by things like race, color, sexual orientation, or gender identity. And the labor movement, which is focused on material and economic change, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes the people who are interested in things like material and economic change, like labor movements, are apathetic or even hostile to the kind of cultural left movements that we see, associating them with privilege, education, and a kind of orientation towards things like the service industry rather than blue-collar kind of jobs, right? And I'm not sure how to actually solve that problem. Okay. I think that one way to resolve it is by trying to convince workers that not only do they benefit from these kinds of policies of inclusion, but their own rights and their own status is way safer in the hands of progressives than it is in the hands of Republicans, precisely for the reason that you mentioned, right? Which is that Republicans are often very willing to use some of the workers' animosity when it's useful for them to challenge things like immigration or to roll back the feminist movement. But they have no real interest in actually helping them achieve real material gains for themselves. So the minute that they're not useful anymore, you start seeing things like right to work legislation get rolled in.
Right.
And I thought you saw something very similar with Donald Trump, right? Where Donald Trump, when he was campaigning in 2016, sounded at points almost like a left-wing populist, right? With this drain the swamp, we're going to have the greatest Medicare system in the world, all that kind of stuff, right? Or, the system is broken because people like me have taken it away. And enough people voted for him, not a majority, but enough to get his ass into office for 4 years. And then the minute he was in office, what did you see? His major legislative initiative was a massive tax break to the ruling classes.
Yeah.
Massive. Right?
And he, of course, appointed the swamp into his cabinet anyways,
Yeah. I mean, you won't find a much more swampier cabinet than Donald Trump, right?
Right.
So there's no sincerity behind this kind of pseudo-populist working class kind of appeal to what he was agitating for. For him, the working class base was a tool to be used and then discarded once it had kind of served its purpose for elites like himself. Right?
Yeah. No, I that's right. So is there, so I think we talked a little, I guess I can kind of sum up a little bit. There's obviously the material necessity that we need to get labor organized in that respect. Is there any strategy? I know this might just rely on making the right argument. Is there any strategy though, beyond that, about ideologically changing that sort of that divide, right, among labor and stuff? I know you said you didn't quite have an answer, but I didn't know, and maybe in a different respect, if there is a sort of tactic that you've thought about in any respect about changing almost.
I do have a tactic, and it's relying on people like you to change hearts and minds, right? I'm only half kidding about that, by the way, right? I think that there's sometimes this yearning to look to theorists for a kind of blueprint on what we should do going forward. And I do think it's partly our job to provide advice on that. But really, it's up to everyday people who want to see change to take it upon themselves to try to achieve that, right? And I think there are a lot of different levels to that. People like yourself, and I'll add me into that mix, try to change hearts and minds by doing what we do best, which is making theoretical arguments as accessible as possible for ordinary people so that they can think more critically about the kind of society they live in. And I think that's an important job. I don't think it's the only important job, like some more academics that I know do. But it's an important job, right? I think that there's a lot of things that activist groups that are involved in a lot of those civil society networks that I talked about do, which is also crucial, right? Which is demonstrating that things like cooperative living can actually function. Demonstrating like if you agitate for political change, you can actually see some political change, however marginal, right? That's all very important. I think doing things like trying to make socialist and left-wing literature more available to people is really, really crucial. And there are a number of different party organizations I could think of in my own country, networks like Courage, for example, associated with the NDP, that are trying to do just that. So we need a multi-pronged kind of offensive in order to be successful. And I don't think that anyone in that process is so vital sorry, what's the way to put it? I think that everyone in that process is absolutely vital. We can't do without any of it.
Gotcha. All right, man. Well, I suppose we're kind of on the hour mark. There was a lot there. There's going to be obviously a lot more that I'm going to have to, I guess, go through again. A lot of this is stuff that, I've obviously thought about and talked about even on this channel and stuff. But it's been a bit since I've really dug into liberal literature and anything like that. I went through a whole stint about a year ago of really going into Locke and Rousseau and relooking at a lot of these things and maybe relooking at sort of political organization as it stands in a sort of, I guess, the liberal approach. Obviously this past year I've been really into critical theory and psychoanalysis, so I guess this is good to get my brain back into a more, I want to say in some ways, a more political approach. I think when we think of politics, it almost always relies on a sort of liberal ideal and how we deal with it. So yeah, this is interesting. Thanks so much for coming on. Yeah, is there anything you want to leave, like where people can follow you? Again, most people probably like on this podcast know who you are and everything. I don't know if you want to shout out your Twitter. I think you also, do you have a YouTube channel now?
No, that didn't materialize actually, because the guy I was working with went through a personal tragedy. Don't want to get into it, but that just fell through the cracks. But yeah, absolutely. If your followers are interested, they can add me at Matt Paul Prof. Also, check us out on the Plastic Pills or podcast. We do things every week, and I'm sure it'll be of interest to your listeners. And I guess the last thing is I just wanted to wish everyone a happy holiday, whatever religious holiday you happen to entertain.
Oh God, you really are liberal, aren't you?
No, I'm have a good break. Drink some eggnog, drink some booze, and have a good time.
No, I'm with you. Happy holidays, dude, and thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, good to talk to you.
All right, I'll see you, buddy.